This is the city, Atlanta, Georgia. 1,089,000 people live here. People that work hard, play hard. At the end of the day, they come home to rest. Upholstered furniture is there to provide a place to sit, relax comfortably in padded chairs and sofas in the fabric of their choice. Sometimes this furniture gets abused, neglected. Fabric needs replacing. That's where my dad comes in. He's an upholsterer.
The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
It was Monday, June 10th, 1968. The temperature was a pleasant 84 degrees as predicted by Guy Sharp, a local and beloved weatherman. It was a good day for a boy to be outside playing during summer vacation, but I had a job to do. I was my dad's built-in helper. I was sweeping the floor at the shop my dad had in the basement of our colonial-style home. I had just finished making size 30 buttons that would be needed to diamond tuft a chair my dad would soon be working on when we heard the phone ring. My mom upstairs answered the phone as was custom and soon banged on the floor. This was the agreed upon signal for my dad to pick up. It was a customer calling. Hello?
Mr. Williams?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Miss Jenkins from the Grant Park Jenkins. My neighbor, Miss Pardue, told me you did some work for her last summer.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have a divan my mother left me. It's covered in mohair, and something awful has happened.
What's that, ma'am?
Well, my nephew Claude from Athens was house sitting for me while I went to Savannah to visit my cousin Charlene. You see, she's a teacher at their art and design school, and we were having a lovely time visiting Forsyth Park and shopping downtown.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Yes, well, as I was saying, Claude must have had some wild party here. You know, he's one of them hippie types.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, when I got back, my mother's divan had a rip and Claude was nowhere to be seen. Can you come over and take a look? I think I'm going to have the whole thing recovered.
Yes, ma'am. Tell me where you live and we'll be over tomorrow to take a look.
You know where that Piggly Wiggly store is in Little 5 Points? Well, of course, we don't live there. We live just off Moreland Avenue on McLendon Avenue, number 1230 to be exact.
Yes, ma'am. We'll be over there at 2 p.m. tomorrow. The next afternoon, we prepared for our call to Mrs. Jenkins at her residence on McLendon Avenue. My mother had decided to go with us. She wanted us to drop her off at the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, otherwise known as A&P. She would shop for groceries while Dad and I called on Mrs. Jenkins. We loaded into my dad's red 1966 Ford Econoline Supervan with the extended cargo area. My dad sat in the driver's seat, Mom was in the passenger seat, and I took my place on the motor compartment between the seats that housed the aspirated inline 6-cylinder engine, the basic power plant for the Ford Econoline van. The metal housing was warm and uncomfortable and sat a mere 20 inches from the windshield. If the van had been forced to stop abruptly, my portly body would have been thrown through the windshield to certain death. But it was the 60s. Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. The Vietnam War was raging, and Nixon would soon be elected. There were bigger issues than child endangerment. After dropping my mom off, we arrived at Mrs. Jenkins at the agreed-upon time of 2 p.m. It was one of my jobs to carry in the sample books of fabrics. I opened the back door of the van and pulled out 2 sample books, one from La France Fabrics and the other from Erickson. They were both local Atlanta fabric jobbers selling cut yardage to upholstery shops. I particularly liked the Erickson salesman. He often stopped by the shop and gave us tickets to the Braves game to thank us for pushing his fabric. My dad would often invite my Uncle Rule to go with us to these games. Dad would parch some goobers, aka roast peanuts, and take them with us to the game. We would spend the day watching the Braves and leaving behind a pile of peanut shells under our seat. It was what would pass for a good time back then. At the door, Mrs. Jenkins greeted us. She was an older, blue-haired lady. The blue hairs were women around the Atlanta area at the time and often outlived their spouses and spent their time attending social events and spending their deceased husband's money, or either holding on to it so tightly they would pinch a penny to its certain death. It was yet to be determined where Mrs. Jenkins fell in that category.
Hello, Mr. Williams. Thank you for coming over. And who's this little fella?
This is my son.
Well, aren't you a cute little fella? No, ma'am. I'm an awkward, overweight 12-year-old kid forced to work with his dad and help him move heavy furniture from your house into our ugly red van. This will cause me to have back problems in my 60s. Y'all come on in and I will show you the parlor where the divan is.
I was ignored per usual, as kids often were in the 60s.
Here's my mom's divan. It was covered in a beautiful mohair. I guess it's faded some. It was still in good shape until Claude tore it somehow.
Yes, ma'am, it was certainly Claude.
I knew it. I knew it was Claude. But how can you tell?
Do you have any animals in the house, ma'am?
Why, yes. There's Mr. Dookie. He's my Yorkshire Terrier. And Meow-Satone. He's my Siamese cat.
Mrs. Jenkins, you see those marks around the tear? It looks like claw marks. I think the tear got bigger as it became a tug-of-war between your dog and cat. Plus, your cat has been marking its territory on the divan for a long time, adding to more agitation of the dog. By the way, it will be a slight upcharge to sanitize the divan from cat urine before we work on it. It's for your safety and ours.
Well, my word. It's a good thing I didn't accuse Claude about my divan getting clawed. What should I do with such unruly cats and dogs?
Me, I would roll up a newspaper and beat them with it. But that's not my place to say. Please feel free to look through these fabric samples while I take a few measurements. After giving Dad an odd look and also being somewhat embarrassed by the pea stains, Mrs. Jenkins spent 2 hours looking at every fabric sample in the book, wasting what little daylight I would have left to play in when I got home. As if Dad would have let me off early. She finally settled on a tapestry-type fabric, and we loaded up her sofa. On the way home, we stopped by and picked up Mom at the A&P. 2 weeks later, we delivered Mrs. Jenkins' recovered divan. She was delighted, another satisfied customer. Claude did return to his aunt and explain he had left one night to meet up with some friends at the varsity. He woke up 2 days later under the bleachers at Tech Stadium with a sign around his neck stating, "Dog lover, go home." Mr. Dookie and Mousy Tongue spent the rest of their days unable to go into Mrs. Jenkins' parlor. No animals were otherwise hurt or beaten with a rolled up newspaper. My dad explained to me on the way home, it makes a lot of noise, but a loosely rolled up paper doesn't hurt. I remember that as I had fallen prey to that when I was younger. By the way, at 68 I have a slip disc in my back and my leg goes numb.